So I think we'll get started. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I hope you're well. I recognize some of the names here in this list. My name's Lauren. I work for Seven Lakes Alliance as a conservationist. Unfortunately, we can't have hosts at our building right now, but we're all working from home on all kinds of different conservation projects. I'd like to introduce Kalyn Bickerman-Martens. She's a researcher at the University of Maine. Her work focuses on the health of Maine's native bees in wild blueberry fields, and her research interests include parasitology, disease ecology, toxicology, and citizen science and science communication. So I'll let her take it away. I will be on the call if you have any questions about Seven Lakes at the end of the talk. And then also as a reminder, if you want to ask a question, click the button to raise your hand so that we can see you and we can unmute you. Yeah, go ahead, Kalyn.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen now. It's going to be a PowerPoint. So let me go there. And okay, Lauren, does that look good to you?
Looks great.
Okay, then I'll start. Great. As Lauren said, my name is Kalyn, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Maine. And my work focuses actually on the health of Maine's bumblebees. So I'll be talking about native bees in Maine, but also bumblebees. And then I'll go into the Maine Bumblebee Atlas, which is a citizen science initiative that is led by the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. University of Maine is also participating in that. And that our final year was basically last year, but we're still in some research stages with some of the data that was collected. So I'll talk about that. And if you're interested in native bees, this is pretty much the guide that you should be looking into. So it's called The Bees in Your Backyard. It is full of hundreds of beautiful photographs showing the diversity of North America's bees. And it's written by two researchers, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful guide to our native bees. And that's where a lot of the images in this presentation will come from. So I do suggest this. And a little bit of an outline of my talk today. So first I'll talk about native bees in Maine and who they are. And then I'll go into bumblebees specifically, who are native bees, and talk about their life cycle, their pollination, what species are in Maine. So pretty much what you might expect to see, especially in your area. Well, I say your area, you guys could be from all over the place for all I know. Things that you can do to help native bees, including planting native plants. And then I'll talk about my citizen science work with the Maine Bumblebee Atlas and some results that we have to date. So who are Maine's native pollinators? Well, of course, we have our bumblebees. We do have honeybees. So usually at this point of the talk, I say, hey, are honeybees native? And most everybody at this point tends to know that no, honeybees are not native to North America. They were brought over in the 1600s by the Europeans. They're from the Mediterranean area, so they are not some of our native pollinators. You might see monarchs, so butterflies, moths, lepidopterans, those are also pollinators. That is a clear wing hummingbird moth right there. I don't know if you can see my control or my pointer. Can you see the pointer, Lauren?
No, I can't. Oh, yeah, I can. Sorry, it's just small.
That's okay. So that's a clear wing hummingbird moth, which a lot of people actually mistake for hummingbirds because of the way they move, but they are moths. Flies can also be pollinators. Ants can be pollinators as they go after the nectaries in plants. Beetles, and of course hummingbirds. We should be seeing our hummingbirds pretty soon here in the next month or so as they make their migration north. Does anybody well, I'm so used to giving this to an actual audience who's in front of me, but I always say, does anybody have any idea how many native bee species are in Maine? And I have people throw out guesses, and the answer is 278 species. And that was from a checklist that was published in the last couple of years by my advisor, Dr. Frank Drummond, and one of our colleagues, Dr. Allison Dibble. So there are a lot more bee species than people usually could have guessed. And basically, what is the ecological role behind our pollinators? Like, why do we need them? What is this ecosystem service? And the definition of pollination is the movement of pollen grains between two flowers, which results in fruit or seeds, or fruit and seeds. And roughly about 9 out of 10 flowering plants need animal pollinator for fertilization. And you can think of it as a third. So 1 out of every 3 bites of food you put in your mouth, you can think a pollinator for. The value, it's really hard to put a monetary value on this service, but it's in the billions, hundreds of billions of dollars per year. And insects are considered some of our most important pollinators, principally bees. If you can see my pointer, here are Maine's wild blueberries in the upper right hand of this page. Here is a bumblebee pollinating those wild blueberry flowers. Here's a bumblebee in a squash flower. Cucumbers, tomatoes, apple down here. So lots and lots of plants depend on our pollinators. And as for native bees in general, there are over 20,000 species of bees around the world, 4,000 of which are in North America, and about 400 of those are in New England. So still a very incredible number. And a lot of people think of bees as having these giant colonies, much like they kind of revert back to thinking about bees as honeybees. But in truth, most of these native bee species are solitary. They don't live in huge colonies. There is no queen bee. And some may even nest communally, meaning that their nests are near one another, but that does not mean that they are in the same colony. And then other bee species practice a way of life called kleptoparasitism, or cuckoo bees. And if you know what a cuckoo bird does, she lays her eggs in other birds' nests, and then the other bird will raise her young. These bees are very similar in that they lay their eggs in other bees' nests and kind of take over, and that's how that works. So very, very diverse life cycles for our bee species. And this is a great photo from that book that I mentioned earlier. Neither of these bee species is actually in the United States or North America, but it is a great demonstration of the size difference. So these are both bees. That very large bee on the quarter there is a Xylocopa, which is a type of carpenter bee. Oh, I'm sorry. It does say both of these are found in North America. I had a different graphic here. I apologize. So yeah, the Perdita on the left compared to Xylocopa on the right. Although it does list here the largest and smallest bees in the world, which are not found in North America. But this picture is of 2 species that are found in North America. And we actually do have Xylocopa species here in Maine. If you've ever seen, they look like bumblebees, but their abdomens are very shiny instead of being quite furry. And they're the bees that kind of chew holes in your porch that you might see dart in and out, but they're not bumblebees, they're carpenter bees. And a little bit about how I'll refer to bee species. So if any of you ever took high school biology, you might have remembered that King Philip came over for good soup. So that's how we assign different animals a place. So they're all of course, they're all insects. So they're in class Insecta. And then they're in the order Hymenoptera. So that's the bees, the wasps, and the ants. And then bees, and then you can go down to family, genus, and species. So for instance, a bumblebee that we have here in Maine, Bombus impatiens, so its genus name is Bombus, and its species name is impatiens. Here's the honeybee. It is in the order Hymenoptera. So it comes from, a lot of these species names come from Latin or Greek. So Hymenoptera comes from the words for married wings, because their wings are actually hooked together. They have 4 wings, so 2 on either side, a forewing and a hind wing, and those are hooked together, so married wings. And then their genus name is Apis mellifera. And basically, honeybees, they're Latin name means honey bearer. They also used to be known as Apis mellifica, which is honey maker. So those two names have been historically used for honeybees. So the bee life cycle, they go through a complete metamorphosis with 4 different life stages. So here you have the egg, and then, or I'm sorry, we're missing the picture of the egg here, but this is a larva, and this is a pre-pupa, a pupa, and then the adult. Here's a great picture of the larva of a bee that's wrapped around this pollen ball that its mother had left for it. Most of our bees are solitary nesters. They build a single cell. They provision that with a pollen and nectar ball. The female will lay an egg on it and then seal it all up. So most of our bees, they never meet their offspring. Again, apologize if you hear crying children or yelling children in the background. Those are mine. Here's a great cross-section of a twig nest of a native bee. Each of these is an individual nest cell with a pollen ball. The males will emerge before the females, so the males are laid toward the front of the stem, so that when those males emerge, they can go and find mates from other nests. And also, if the females were to emerge before the males, they'd pretty much destroy them coming out. So don't want that to happen. They have haploid diploid sex determination. So if you've heard of that, basically males have half the number of chromosomes as females, and that's because female eggs are laid from fertilized eggs. Females are laid from fertilized eggs, and males emerge from unfertilized eggs. And it's great for sex determination that the mother bee can determine whether she's going to lay a female egg or a male egg. There's a wide range of nesting sites, although most of our native bees are ground nesters. And I actually stumbled upon a great nest aggregation a couple of days ago that I wanted to go check out today when it was a little bit sunnier. So about 70% of them are ground nesters, although some may nest in rock crevices, plant stems, abandoned rodents' nests. That's a really great favorite of bumblebees. Down here is a bee digging a tunnel in the ground. And then over here, these are 2 andronids of the mining bees. They're nesting communally, so that these bees are actually sharing a nest entrance, but they lay their own eggs in their own tunnels inside. They don't raise their young together or anything. And I like to think of bee sociality not as discrete, but actually more on a continuum. So most of our native bees are solitary. So every female builds her own nest, gathers all her resources, and lays her own eggs. And then she'll seal her nest shut, and then she never meets her offspring. And this is a great photo from the USDA of a sealed nest cavity. Each of these is a pollen ball with pollen and nectar that she's provisioned each cell with. And each of these little grains, that looks like a little grain of rice, that's a bee egg. And that egg will hatch. So there are also nest aggregations where solitary nests are built close together. And that's what I was talking about when I said I saw a lot of I'm sorry, I have a crying baby very close by. And that's really great because there could be some sort of nest defense, even if they're not sharing the same, if they're not caring for the same offspring. Communal, you can kind of think of that as living in an apartment building, like those andronids on the last page where they share the same entrance. Semi-social, which is kind of rare, especially up here where our season is so short, where there may be some sort of division of labor between related females, but then really a lot of people think, as I said before, of honeybees and bumblebees being eusocial, which is where there's a queen bee, and then she lays all the eggs, and then she has her worker daughters. So down here in this photo, this big bee here, she's the queen. This is a bumblebee nest. here is her brood. So these are capped nest cells that her daughters here are taking care of. And then these are nectar pots. So there are a couple distinguishing features that make a bee species eusocial. So of course, if you compare bumblebees versus honeybees, honeybees have much larger colonies. Here in Maine, where our season again is so short, bumblebee colonies pretty much get up to maybe 50 individuals at their peak, not like the tens of thousands of honeybees. And here's a graphic showing mimicry between species. So here we have flies. So all of these insects on the left here are flies. Bees are in the middle, and then wasps here on the right. And a lot of people will, especially when they first start looking for natives in their gardens, may mistake wasps or even flies for them. And this is just a great graphic showing how some distinguishing features. So flies have more triangular heads. They have really short antennae, and they only have one pair of wings. Like I said before, Hymenoptera all have two pairs of wings. Wasps are more related to bees. They can also sting. As we know, flies do not sting. And the key distinguishing feature between bees and wasps is that bees eat pollen, wasps tend to eat meat, and then wasps don't usually collect pollen. And on bees, we can find special pollen collecting hairs that we call scopa. And I always ask, why would it be beneficial for a fly to look like a bee or a wasp? And of course, it's because bees and wasps have this great defense mechanism in that they do sting. Flies do not, so it might be beneficial for them to look like something more dangerous than they are. And then here's a little bit about Maine's native bees. So there are 278 species in 6 different families. So here we are in mid to late April in Maine. We've had some warm days, some not so warm days. It's been a little bit wet. I've seen some andrenids out. So these are our mining bees, and these guys come out pretty early. They're soil nesters. These are the ones, if you ever come upon an ant's nest, it looks like an ant's nest with a large hole, that might be an andrenid's nest. They're some of the first to emerge in the spring. And they're fairly small. These sweat bees, this other group down here, some of these are very brightly colored, like race car green, but most are brown or black. These are very, very tiny. And we also have leaf cutter bees. If you ever look at your rhododendron and see almost like a half moon cutout, that could have been a leaf cutter bee collecting leaves to line their nests. And they actually carry the pollen on their bellies. So that's how you can distinguish them. They've got very thick scope on, looks like fuzzy bellies. Mason or orchard bees. If you have ever noticed somebody owns what they call a bee hotel, which is like a piece of wood with lots of holes drilled in, they're often used by these osmia bees. And then of course we have the cuckoo bees. So those are the kleptoparasites, the ones who lay their eggs in other bees' nests. And there are many more different kinds of bees. So we have our bumblebees, which I'll talk about, carpenter bees, which I had mentioned, squash bees, cellophane bees. I actually got a great photo of a cellophane bee the other day. So those bees are out as well. So named because they line their nest with a substance that is kind of like cellophane to protect it from the elements. Who are the bumblebees? As I mentioned, they are in the order Hymenoptera, and they're in the same family as honeybees. And then, so their genus is called Bombus, which literally means buzzing. And here is about their life cycle. So here we are, as I said, so mid to late April in Maine. I have heard reports that some people have already spotted queens. Queen bumblebees are very large, about the size of the length of your thumb, and they're going to be foraging on the stuff that's already out. So if you have a rhododendron in your yard, that's a very common first place for them to be. I often see them if I ever go to like a nursery and they've got flowering plants outside. There's like that's Home Depot is a good place to find them as well. So these queen bees have spent the summer overwintering underground, and they're emerging due to a cue, whether it's longer day length or a combination of that and warmth. And what these queen bees will do is they'll forage and they will found a new nesting site. They're not diggers, so what they'll do is they'll probably find an old rodent's nest or a crevice, and then she'll start foraging and she'll start provisioning her nest with pollen and nectar, and she'll begin to lay eggs. So here she is. She's got this provision balls that's like pollen and nectar mixed together. And then we'll see these queen bees out and about for quite a while. If you see a queen bee who is flying very low to the ground, kind of zigzagging amongst the clover and the dandelion, she's probably looking for a nest site, especially if she's around like your foundation. I always find them like maybe underneath the root of a tree. And then starting in about probably June, we're going to start seeing the first workers emerge. And these first workers are pretty tiny, maybe about the size more of your pinky nail. And the reason why they're so small is because the queen mother was the only one caring for them. So she did the best she could. And now those new workers will take over the duties of foraging for the colony. And that queen will stay home in their colony and just lay eggs and let the workers do all the provisioning and caring for the brood, which is the young. And then the colony will grow and grow and grow up until, again, something triggers something called senescence, which is when the female bumblebee starts laying unfertilized eggs, which turn into males, as well as new queens. And this is probably triggered by colder weather coming in, shorter day length. The new queens and the males will disperse from their colony. They will mate with queens and males from other colonies. And then everybody dies with the first frost, except for these newly mated queens that go underground where they'll overwinter. So the great thing about bumblebees, especially up here in our temperate Maine climate, is that they're large-bodied and furry. So we kind of refer them even as warm-blooded. They're able to vibrate their flight muscles very quickly. And bumblebees have an open circulatory system, as do all insects. And by vibrating those muscles, they can warm up what we call hemolymph, which is akin to mammalian blood. And they can actually shunt that through their bodies to help keep them warm. So bumblebees can fly in temperatures below freezing even, which a lot of insects cannot do. So bumblebees are even up toward the Arctic Circle. They're important commercial pollinators, again, because they're large-bodied, so they carry lots and lots of pollen. They're able to fly in cooler temperatures. They're able to fly in weather conditions such as like drizzle, rain, even snow, which honeybees cannot do. And as you probably all know, the honeybee business is a big business, especially when it comes to crop pollination. So about 20 years ago, commercial pollination for bumblebees started getting started in Europe and then was brought over here to the United States. So you can actually buy colonies of bumblebee to set out in your crops. Now, these are mostly used in greenhouses to pollinate things like tomatoes and peppers. But now, I don't know if anybody's driven through a blueberry barren in the past few years, but we're starting to see more and more of these out there as well. So that helps complement the pollination that doesn't happen when just the honeybees are out there. And there are days when the honeybees won't fly, the bumblebees will fly. And here's a cool graphic of a paper that came out a few years ago showing that as bumblebees fly, they get a positive electrical charge on their hairs, these little setae, and pollen has a negative electrical charge, so it is almost attracted. So it is attracted to their hairs and sticks to them extremely well. So bumblebees and a lot of our native bees, such as andrenids, can do something called sonication, which is also known as buzz pollination. And now these are, slowed down quite a bit. But what these bees are doing is they've grabbed on to the anthers of these flowers with their front legs, and they're vibrating at a frequency of about 400 hertz, which is causing the pollen to flow out of these flowers and onto their bodies. So this is a really neat image of that. In these bumblebees, you can see right here, this is actually pollen those bees have packed onto their pollen baskets on their legs, which are known as corbiculi. So not just bumblebees, but also Jennings carpenter bees and a few other bees can do buzz pollination. Honeybees cannot do buzz pollination. So if you've ever gone by Rosa rugosa or any type of rose, and there's a bumblebee in there, and she goes inside, she's kind of rolling around and making a very loud buzzing, she's probably practicing buzz pollination. And the great thing about buzz pollination is it's really effective for plants that have poricidal anthers. And by poricidal, you can imagine a salt shaker where the pollen is in the salt shaker, and you really have to force it out through these pores on top of the anthers. And bees that practice buzz pollination are a lot more effective at getting pollen out of those plants than honeybees who cannot do that. This map is showing, it's a diversity heat map of all the bumblebee species in North America. The warmer the color, the more species diversity in those areas. And the neat thing about this is that for a lot of species, we see diversity increase as you head toward the equator, and there's almost an opposite pattern when it comes to bumblebees. So bumblebees are very temperate. So you can look at Maine, which has 17 historic species, and compare that to a place like Florida, where they have maybe 1 to 5 down here toward the Keys. So again, bumblebees, we see less diversity in warmer climates, and then highest diversity here in the Rockies, that mountain range, and also the Western United States. Here are the 17 historic species in Maine. No need to memorize them. The one thing I will point out to you is you may have heard of the rusty-patched bumblebee, which was the first federally listed bumblebee in North America. So Bombus affinis used to be in Maine. We have not seen it probably for about 15 years now. And then there's this bee, which is the yellow-banded bumblebee, Bombus terricola, which is a close relative of the rusty-patched bumblebee. This species was proposed for listing under the Endangered Species Act, although it was determined just a few months ago that it did not warrant listing at this time. We still have this bee here in Maine. I've actually seen it here on the mid-coast. I've seen it down east, but its numbers are far lower than they used to be. And this is Bombus terricola, the yellow-banded bumblebee right here that I'm circling. This is so the rusty-patched bumblebee, this is the rusty-patched bumblebee's historic range, this pink area. So you can see that included most of Maine. And then at this point, these green areas are probably where you'd be most likely to find that bee now. So its range has definitely shrunk. Again, that includes coastal Maine, but we have not seen a rusty-patched bumblebee here in about 15 years. And I always point out, so bumblebeewatch.org is a website where you can upload photos of bumblebee observations that you take that get identified by experts. And this is an occurrence map for the rusty-patched bumblebee. Most of these sightings are in the past couple of years. This sighting here in Maine is actually a picture that was taken over 10 years ago in Rockport. No exact date for this picture is known, but Amy Campbell is one of our volunteers for the Maine Bumblebee Atlas. So that's where this spot comes from. But if you look at this map here, compare it to the historic range, you can see it's shrunk quite a bit. So we're seeing people are still finding this bee in Minnesota, Wisconsin, but not really much anywhere else. The yellow-banded bumblebee also has a very wide range all the way down the mid-Atlantic, across to the Midwest, up through the Maritimes. Definitely includes all of Maine. And here's where we're currently finding that bee now. So you can compare them, and you can see its range is almost shifted northward. And I'm going to quickly flip through a few of our species that we find here in Maine. So Bombus ternarius, which is an orange bumblebee, has these very bold orange stripes on her abdomen. A lot of people will say, oh, I've seen the rusty-patched bumblebee, but actually they've seen this bee. This bee is fairly common, probably the most common bumblebee up Augusta-ish area up through Orono, but not so much here on the mid-coast. I think I've seen maybe one individual here. Key characteristics, we mostly ID bumblebees on the wing if we need to by the stripes on their abdomens. And then if you want to do males versus females, females have this flatter or this area on her hind leg called the corbicula, which is her pollen basket, and males do not collect pollen, so they lack this basket. But there's also a subspecies of bumblebee called Cythrus, which are cuckoo bumblebees, and those females don't collect pollen either because all they do is take over other bees' nests. So then that doesn't always work. Some general rules. You wouldn't be seeing any male bumblebees in Maine, probably not until maybe August at the earliest, up through November, but males tend to have like really fuzzy yellow faces. If you look at a honeybee colony, those workers tend to be very uniform in size, but when it comes down to bumblebees, workers can be very different in size, and that's mostly due to nutrition. So how well they were fed while they were growing. And again, males don't collect pollen. So diversity of diversity of Maine's bumblebees. Here we have the Bombus ternarius, the yellow banded. This one, the common eastern bumblebee, they're all around the United States. This very common bee down here in the mid-coast. This is a male. You can see he almost looks very fly-like with those giant eyes. Bombus borealis, the northern amber bumblebee, very beautiful. And then another common bee here in the mid-coast, Bombus vagans, the half-black bumblebee. Here's a free poster you can download online, but what I did was all the arrows are bees that can be found here in Maine historically. The green arrows are ones that we have found through the Maine Bumblebee Atlas, and then the red arrows are pointing to bees that we have not seen in our surveys yet. So bees that used to be here based on museum specimens, but may no longer be here. Here's another bee, Rufocinctus. So this bee is hard to ID just because there are so many different color variations. I'm gonna flip through these. Bombus perplexus is a bee that you might start seeing fairly soon. They're an earlier season bee. They're known for their highlighter yellow coloration. So a lot of bees are, I don't know if I have a good picture, but more of a creamy yellow. And then these Bombus perplexus, the confusing bumblebee, which also has different color patterns, but they tend to be this gorgeous deep yellow. I find them a lot on milkweed. Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, lives up to its name. It is quite common, all around the United States now at this point. This is the species that's used for commercial pollination, so they're doing great. This is the half-black bumblebee, so you can see she's got a little bit more yellow on that abdomen. Bombus bimaculatus, the two-spotted, is another very early season bee. These bees will be one of the first out. And then this is the bee that was proposed to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, but it was found not to be warranted, the yellow banded bumblebee. This is the bee that's a close relative of the rusty patch bumblebee bee. These are some other bees. Let's go through this. Okay, so this is the rusty patch bumblebee. So this one's been listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. It is rare, so possibly extirpated from Maine, which means it no longer occurs here. They're so named because they have this little ridge of rust-colored hair on their top of their abdomen here. Although it's a little bit tricky to ID them because not all of them have that distinctive patch. I will say for bumblebee ID, it's not as easy as it may seem from some of these graphics. So a lot of us rely on microscopes, so using a dissecting microscope to really get them down to species based on other characteristics as well. So what's going on with our bumblebees today? So the long and short of it is basically that some species are doing quite well, and then other species are not doing well at all. It's not a very clear-cut story. A lot of people are saying, oh, the bees are all dying, right? The bees are dying. And it's actually, yes, some bee species are dying, and they're not around as much as they used to be, but some species are doing just fine and kind of taking over that open niche. So the key point is about 10 years ago, a paper came out that showed decline in several species in the eastern United States. And this graph here showing relative abundance on the left, and relative abundance is basically if it was a 1, you'd be saying 100% of all bees you catch in an area is that species. So you can think of it in percentiles. And then here are the bee species down here. So for instance, Bombus affinis historically, so this dark bar used to make about 10% of all bees in an area, and now is down to pretty much 0. Whereas you look at the common eastern bumblebee made up about 40% of bees, which is very high. And in this survey made up about 70% of all bees today. So we're seeing shifting relative abundances, meaning that something seems to be happening. And the key thing is declining populations tend to have higher levels of a fungal infection that we have called Nosema bombi, and even lower genetic diversity. So I'll talk a little bit more about Nosema bombi. There was something called the invasive pathogen hypothesis, because as I mentioned before, in the 1990s, they brought over commercial bumblebees. What they did was they sent them to Europe first to get the rearing process started, because rearing bumblebees, so getting a queen to lay her eggs and then raising those, isn't very easy. So in the 1990s, they used Bombus impatiens, brought those queens back over, and then we started to see a decline in a lot of different in a few different species in North America. And the idea was that a virulent, so a more severe strain of this fungal infection, Nosema bombi, was introduced from Europe through colonies that were reared and then brought back over. So what was found when they did genetic analysis, so this paper about 4 years ago took museum specimens. So these Nosema bombi, they're a fungal pathogen, so they're in these infective spores, and they're very hardy. So you can still actually find them in dried museum specimens. So this author took old museum specimens before the commercial bumblebee trade started, and they genetically analyzed the fungal pathogen in those bees compared to the fungal pathogen that is around today, and found that they were no different. So there wasn't no virulent strain that suddenly appeared. What's more likely is that something is making these bees more susceptible to be infected by this pathogen, whether it's a pesticide or loss in diversity of floral resources. It's probably a combination of things. And then, of course, the disappearance or the decline of a lot of bee species has been in the news for the past few years. So here's an article that was written about 3 years ago in the Portland Press Herald about the rusty patch bumblebee disappearing from Maine. And then there are all these articles from around the world. Here's a great article from Time magazine about the rusty patch bumblebee, but actually is a picture of Bombus terrestris, which is a European species which is invasive. So just I like to point out that that's kind of funny. Basically, the conservation status for bumblebees, we first started seeing declines in the past couple of decades. Some common species are now more rare, but some species have actually increased in relative abundance, and even expanding their ranges. And here are 4 bumblebee species that historically have been found in Maine and have been found to either be gone from Maine or in decline. So the yellow-banded bumblebee, which I've mentioned before, the RC patch bumblebee, that endangered species, the American bumblebee, which we also have not seen in our surveys yet, and then Ashton's cuckoo bumblebee, which is a cuckoo parasite of these 2 species here, the red yellow-banded and the rusty patched. And here's a similar study done in Maine's blueberry fields in 2012 by Sarah Bushman, showing different relative abundances. So same sort of graph, where on the left you can think of it as percentiles, and then down here we have species on the bottom comparing historical years versus today, or I should say more like 8 years ago. And we do see shifting relative abundances. And what are the key threats to bumblebees? So as I mentioned, commercially reared bumblebees for agriculture might be bringing over diseases to wild populations, and that includes more than just Nosema bombi. There are other pathogens, other viruses bees can spread to one another, especially when they're in close quarters and being introduced to new areas. Fragmentation and loss of habitat. So as we put up more pavement, we lose wildflowers. As we mow our roadsides, we lose pollinator corridors. We have more pesticide use, so widespread pesticide use. And then we not only lose possibly directly affecting those bees, but also getting rid of a lot of the wildflowers they depend on. And then climate change. So for instance, Maine springs can be very wet now. And when it's really, really wet, bumblebee queens cannot go out and forage. And if they can't forage, then they die. They can only survive for a few days without leaving their nests. And how can you help? So these are all fairly common sense, but you can provide food. So a variety of flowering plants that bloom throughout the growing season. It's important to remember that a bumblebee and all pollinators, their season is fairly long, from March, April, all the way up through first frost. For a bumblebee colony, they really need floral resources to be blooming all through that season because they're central place foragers. They have their colony and they forage generally within a mile of that colony. So they need to have enough blooming throughout the entire season. You can also provide shelter. They need a variety of places to live. I always suggest maybe just like keep an area of your yard where you've just got like dead trees, whether you have a pile of sticks in the corner of your yard, just some habitat for them. Again, these bee hotels have been more popular in recent years, but they are important that you keep them nice and clean, or else they can get fungal growths in them, or parasites can find them. Here's a bumblebee box. We don't really those haven't been shown to be that effective in Maine, probably because there's plenty of spaces for bumblebees to go. And another thing to keep in mind is trying to use more native plants when you consider planting, because these are plants that have co-evolved with these insects, and they can be more effective, especially when it comes to phenology. So phenology is the timing of when things happen. If you have a plant that let's see, if it blooms at a certain time and that kind of coincides with the growth of a bumblebee colony, that could be much more helpful than something that's totally off in terms of timing. Here are some great resources if you're looking to how to make your lawn more pollinator friendly, have more native plants in your lawn. So we have the Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center. So these links take you right to where you can what plants would be good in Maine. There's a free PDF you can download from the NRCS through the USDA, so pollinator friendly plants. And then you may have heard the term neonicotinoid or neonicotinoid in recent years. Kind of become a buzzword, but so these class of insecticides have been more widely used since the 1990s. They kind of replaced organophosphates in popularity because organophosphates were found to be very hazardous to the health of mammals, including humans. Whereas these, we call them neonics, focus on the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors of insects, and we don't have the same receptors. They don't affect us. The issue with these neonics is they're systemic, so they're taken up by the plant and into the plant tissues. And this is really fantastic for a grower who wants to protect his crop or his plants against sucking insects like thrips, because they can treat the soil, treat the seeds, the plant will take it up, and anything that bites that plant will get this insecticide in their system. But the problem is it's also going into their pollen and nectar and affecting our pollinators. And it can linger for years. It can hang around in the environment. So one thing you can do as a homeowner is try to avoid products containing neonics. And you may see terms imidacloprid, acetamiprid, clethoanidin, so a few other things. And then you may remember there's kind of a scandal a couple years ago where Home Depot and Lowe's signed pledges that they would no longer sell plants that were treated with neonicotinoids. And here's a graphic from the Xerces Society showing you, here's the chemical name of the neonic on the left, what it might be used for, and then common things you might be able to see in the store that would contain that chemical. So now I'm going to end with talking about the Maine Bumblebee Atlas, which is the citizen science project that I work with through Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. So it was a 5-year project. It started, our first season was in 2015, and our last collecting season was last summer in 2019. So what is citizen science? This has become much more popular in the past few years. It's a public participation in scientific research, so it's really a partnership between scientists and non-scientists, where there's actual authentic data that are collected, shared, and analyzed by scientists, but collected by non-scientists. And there's been studies that have shown this not only enhances research effort, because if you think about it, the more people that are collecting data, the more information you're going to get, but it actually has more broad educational impacts. So it's called ecological literacy, where the people who are involved in the project become more interested themselves and maybe even share this interest with other people. So there's a bigger impact. And then, of course, it's really wonderful for projects that need vast amount of data for large scale patterns. So for instance, we're trying to look at bumblebee populations in Maine. Maine is a gigantic state, so IF&W wasn't going to send all their biologists out to collect bumblebees for us. This is a much more effective way to get an idea of population trends with our bumblebees. So we had 2 major objectives of the Bumblebee Atlas. The first was to create the scientific knowledge of the distribution, abundance, habitat use. So Maine, of course, has many different microclimates, habitats all throughout the state. We have mountains, we have oceans, we have, it's a large area. So we wanted to see also not only if species were here, but what floral resources they were using and what habitats they may be connected with. And the other objective was to raise public awareness of and support for native pollinators and their conservation. There are other Maine citizen science projects out there. These are all through IF&W. You may have heard of the Herons Project is still ongoing. The people that I work with in the Bumblebee Atlas have also worked with the Maine Butterfly Survey, Maine Dragonfly and Damselfly Survey. The Butterfly Survey was interesting in that it lasted for more years than it was originally thought they were going to do it for, because people were so interested and kept giving them specimens. And they got 10 new state records, even a new US record from those data. And they found out through the Dragonfly Survey that over a third of all North American dragonflies and damselflies could be found here in Maine, which is pretty neat. Currently, the Maine Bird Atlas is ongoing. And I believe you can still sign up if you want to participate in the Maine Bird Atlas. There was a Maine calling almost a year ago on citizen science projects in Maine. Here we have the National Phenology Network. They have people kind of report when their lilacs are blooming, when they have maple leaf out, so they can see what's going on and track timing of basically spring emergence throughout the United States. So this is a great Maine call. You could, if you really want to go back to April 26th of 2019 and see if there's anything you might want to participate in yourself. So what are the benefits of a bumblebee survey? So the first, we have more information. So we have species richness, distribution, relative abundance. So phenology, those flight periods. So as I mentioned before, some bumblebee species can be found earlier in the season, and then others don't emerge till later. So we just learn more about them. And we can also get more information that's needed for listing. So we want to improve our state listing status, whether a species is endangered, threatened, or of special concern. You can also get habitat conservation. We can target this. And then we also increase public awareness. So we support invertebrate conservation. And so there's a lot of reasons why we would do a Maine bumblebee survey. And what we did was we had a full day workshop. It's about 6 to 8 hours. And we taught people how to collect bumblebees for us. So here's a a demonstration showing how you might take data, or how one of our volunteers might take information when they were collecting. Each specimen has their very own voucher number associated with it. So these specimens were frozen once caught, pinned by our volunteers with that voucher number attached to them, and then sent to Vermont, where one of our partners was responsible for IDing that bumblebee. And we found through the years that people were so interested in learning how to identify bumblebees that we would hold identification workshops separate from these teaching workshops, where people could learn more about their ID, although they were all still sent to Vermont for final ID. But the great thing is that because each voucher specimen has a number, and every time somebody submitted a voucher, that bee was connected to them, and they could always look up later once it was finally ID'd what they were catching. So it was great to relay information back to our volunteers. It wasn't all, everything they gave us wasn't all going to a void. We were reporting our results back to them in a timely manner. Here are just some resources that we have out there. So we do have a website. If you want to go check that out, Maine Bumblebee Atlas, and it has great maps showing distribution. I do have a blog on the FNW website. I have the Bumblebee Atlas Facebook page, which might have brought some of you here today from there. Here are some preliminary results from the first 4 collecting summers. First 4 summers, we held 8 volunteer training workshops, and then we also had those 3 bumblebee species ID workshops. And we trained over 300 people. A little over half of those contributed data from all 16 counties in 500 townships. We had over 16,000 voucher specimens submitted. We also had volunteers who did not want to terminate their specimens. So what they did was they took photo vouchers, and those were separate. We were also tracking a occurrence of these 3 invasive species here in Maine. So this is the wool carder bee. I've seen it down here in Brunswick. These guys are fairly large-bodied and very aggressive with other bees. You may have seen them attacking other bees at your flowers. This is from Europe. The carpenter bee, coming up from the mid-Atlantic. I've seen these in recent years as well. And then the giant resin bee, which is from Asia, have all been found here in Maine. Some preliminary results. This is a graph showing, again, historic relative abundance. Now our relative abundance is on the bottom here in orange versus 2015-2016 collections. So for instance, here at the top, we have the yellow-banded bumblebee. Its historic relative abundance was fairly high here in Maine, maybe 30 to 40%. And then in more recent years, more down to 7%-ish. And then we have other species where the trend is just the opposite. So for instance, the common eastern bumblebee was more like 10% here in Maine, and is now about 40% of all collected specimens. And then each of these stars is on a bee that has historically been found in Maine, but has not been seen in our most recent collections. So these are trend arrows. So the yellow-banded bumblebee is in decline. Of course, we haven't even seen the rusty patched. And then that orange-banded, the ternarius, and the common eastern are both on the rise. But there is hope. So in 2017, a single specimen of Bombish ashtoni, which is Ashton's cuckoo bumblebee, that's the bumblebee that was the cuckoo parasite of the rusty patched bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee, was collected in Aroostook County. We've actually found a couple more from the same exact area in our most recent 2018 collections. So this is a possible indicator of Bombus affinis, so the rusty patched bumblebee still being in Maine. More likely it's parasitizing yellow-banded nests, but just to have it, Ashton's cuckoo bumblebee here in Maine is a big deal because it hasn't been seen in many years. These are 2 maps showing bumblebee occurrence data. So this map here on the left is showing confirmed species by township. So this is pre-Maine Bumblebee Atlas. So there are bumblebees all through Maine. So white townships do not mean that there are no bumblebees there. It just means that we don't have any data. Yet, since the Maine bumblebee atlas started, we've filled in a lot more of those townships. So you can see it used to be centered around areas of population before. So here's like up here in Orono, but now we're getting a lot better cross-section of what's out there in Maine. And I will say that all our volunteers were given permits to collect anywhere on state-owned land. They were instructed to get permission for privately owned land, but they were not allowed to collect in Baxter State Park or Acadia, of course, because that's federal land. But so we try to get as many spots as possible, especially targeting areas in Western Maine and Aroostook County. And then here's our effort map. So these are the total modern records that from each township. As you can see, areas like around Portland or Orono, we have the most records for, but we're still trying to fill in these townships. And if you're interested in bumblebees, there's this great PDF you can download for free online called The Bumblebees of the Eastern United States. And it goes through the bumblebee species we have in the Eastern United States, how to ID them, when you might see them, so when they emerge in the spring, as well as their range maps. And then the authors of that also came out with a book a few years ago that I use for identifying bumblebees called The Bumblebees of North America. So this is all 46 species in North America, and has a great key on the back if that's something you might be interested in. And here's my acknowledgements page. So I work with Beth Swartz at IFNW, Dr. Butler at University of Maine Farmington, Leif Richardson does all of our species IDs up in Vermont. And our project funding is through state wildlife grants, Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund grant, and also if you do the chickadee checkoff on your taxes, that helps fund projects like this, as well as the conservation loon plate. And at this point, I will take any questions you may have. Oh,
Kayla?
yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Great.
This is JJ. We have a lake association in Oakland on Messalonsky, and we're having a discussion amongst the owners as to whether we should spray for ticks this spring. And one of the concerns we had was the lake health. But after listening today, should we be concerned about insect health other than ticks?
I mean, yes. I'm not sure exactly what people are spraying with right now. It's definitely worth researching what chemicals are used and how they may act. But I know that there was a worry. There was like something called tick tubes, or there still is a thing called tick tubes, where people treat cotton balls, and then the mice take the cotton balls to line their nests, and it has like some sort of miticide on it. But bumblebee colonies also use old rodents' nests, so there was like some idea that bumblebees could be affected by that. I think it is a concern, definitely. I don't know too much about how you would treat for ticks.
We were offered two alternative sprays. Each of the sprays, one is put down 3 times a season, the other one is 6. The 6th time a season was, quote, an organic, end quote, spray, able to be used within the 25-foot buffer of a lake, so you could be right up to lakeside. The other was not an organic and was recommended for areas beyond 25 feet of the lake. But we never did speak about any insect impact. We were more primarily looking at the lake environmental impact.
Yeah, I would, without knowing what chemicals they are specifically, I couldn't really give you much guidance on that. But definitely non-target impacts with any pest control strategy is something to consider.
I will. I'm glad I tuned in today. And I'll try to get those chemicals and either contact you or go through Seven Lakes Alliance.
Yeah, I also would be happy to help research. I'm always eager to learn more about what's happening in that realm.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? Well, thanks for coming, everybody. We're doing another webinar next week about water quality in the Belgrade Lakes. Danielle, our lake science director, she will be presenting her findings from the past year. That info is on our website and on our Facebook. So thanks for coming.
Great. Thank you, everyone.